This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 335 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, and for this episode, this is the first episode that I've ever recorded in the country of England, here with my family for a personal vacation. And I thought, you know what, I have to take the opportunity. I have to do what I normally do, which is ruin every family vacation by trying to find some way to shoehorn work into it. And I can say that because my son Will is looking at me and he knows what I'm talking about right here. I do it commonly, and I've of course been doing this for years and years and years in this same kind of way. But I reach out. Well, actually, let me tell the story after I introduce Evin O'Riordan, founder of the Kernel, the brewery here in London. Welcome to the podcast, Evin.
Thank you very much for having me, Jamie.
I reached out to my friend Matt Curtis, editor of Pellicle and longtime British beer writer, and asked him, like, if I have time for just a few things in London, what do I need to do? And he gave me an even longer list than I could ever hope to hit. But then he said, if there's only one thing that you can do, you should talk to Evin at the Kernel, because it's such an important piece of the craft beer story in London. And so that's why we're here. That's why I'm here right now. And over the course of this next hour, we're going to talk to Evin about the Kernel's approach to making craft beer here in a very beer-loving country with so many long brewing traditions. We're going to talk about how they navigate those, both the traditional side of those traditions and the creative side of those traditions, and also find ways to put the Kernel stamp on these beers that also carry a lot of ideas and definitions around them for beer drinkers in the country. There's a heavy weight to that, and we're going to talk about how they find the space, both the creative and the technical space within, this broader, bigger, well-established beer country for the creative expressions of the Kernel. Before we do that, for years, G&D Chillers has chilled the beers you love, partnering with 3,000 plus breweries across the country. They're proud of the cool partnerships they've built, offering 24/7 service and support. G&D builds with non-proprietary parts, expert craftsmanship, and constant innovation. G&D's in-house engineering crew have been piping breweries, wineries, and distilleries for over 30 years. They offer free piping design and consultation with the sale of every chiller they build. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. Also, this episode is sponsored by BSG and their partners HVG, who bring you the very best in German hops, including Amira, the latest from their hop breeding program. With its classic hoppy, slightly herbal, and zesty lemon aromas, it's the ideal hop for those looking to capture the traditional flavor of a classic German lager. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn more. And scheduling freight carriers should be the last thing on a brewer's mind, so why not trust the experts to handle freight for your ingredients? Old Orchard has partnered with a leading logistics firm in the craft beverage industry to transport your flavored craft concentrate blends. When you order 2 pails or more from Old Orchard, you qualify for freight quotes. To get started, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. And if you hear some of those noises in the background, the Kernel is literally under train tracks. Like the brewery, the tap room, the warehouse, it is all under these old arches underneath the train lines. And so we felt like it would just be dishonest to have a podcast with the Kernel where you didn't get the full train experience. It seems to imbue everything that you do.
We all know some brewers that play certain types of music to their fermenting beer in order to get certain effects, transmuting sound into pulses of actual physical vibrations through the beer. So for us, it's a train line. It's not quite as romantic, is it?
That is creating those low frequency rumbles that are somehow helping in that yeast propagation.
It might do something.
Interesting. That is the house character is driven by trains. All right, Evin. Why don't you give us the Kernel story about your personal story, and then and how that intersected with beer, and then what then led to creating the Kernel Brewery here in London?
So immediately prior to setting up the brewery, I'd been working in cheese. So I worked in cheese here in London for 8, 9, 10 years maybe. My dad taught dairy science, microbiology. He taught a number of brewers actually who ended up kind of that I know over here who had my dad as a teacher back in Ireland.
Fermentation is fermentation.
Microbiology is all the little critters that do wonderful things in every form of fermentation. I grew up in Ireland. I studied in Ireland. When I left college, had an open horizon in front of me. Left Ireland as it's a wonderful place, but it's quite a small island, and as you probably have met from maybe meeting some Irish people on your travels, they like to, travel, move away. So coming over here, I got a job selling cheese. I was also studying at the same time, doing a PhD, various other things. But the brewery came from a trip that I made to New York. My old employers, Neal's Yard Dairy, were helping Whole Foods open a cheese shop in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And they needed somebody to go over there for a couple of months to help set up the cheese shop, train the staff, set up all the systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I got that gig, which was really not the worst gig in the world,
Sweet gig. What year was this?
This was 2007.
I'm pretty sure I remember that cheese shop. We lived in New York City at the time.
So this was on the Bowery in Houston.
Yeah. I remember
it's gone now. I think they replaced it with a beer.
They did put in a nice beer store there.
The beer store wasn't there when I was there because the shop had just opened and there was some licensing issue. So it was just an empty space. The cheese shop itself, I don't think it worked quite as well as they hoped. They built a lot of it before I got over, and it wasn't really the way it maybe should have been done in my head anyway.
Okay.
But I'd be talking to the guys I met there. I'd be teaching them about cheese, telling them about who made it, the various different recipes, the historical importance, what type of milk, what type of land, what type of culture this whole thing comes from. And my abiding memories are of going out around the corner mainly to a bar called DBA's because it was just around the corner.
Oh, DBA. Is that first Ave, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Between second and third.
And it, I'd never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
And the guys would sit me down and go, you could try that IPA, but it's different to this one for these reasons, made by this person, whereas that person prefers this sort of style, this person prefers this sort of hopping, it was just like, it both went over my head completely because I had no idea what they were talking about, and also it made complete sense because it was the same language that I was using about cheese to talk to them. They were just reflecting it back to me about beer. And I just had never considered beer in that way. Growing up in Ireland, I would drink Guinness from, maybe an age before I was supposed to be drinking Guinness. But beer is beer, and you drink it in the similar way that beer is consumed in England. It's such a part of the culture that you don't almost even question it. And so having my eyes opened in this sort of way, with a language that I could understand, there's just an approach to eating and drinking,
Sure.
Talking about wine in that way would have been completely normal to me. Talking about beer in this way was suddenly a moment, an epiphany. And then that epiphany turned into like, oh, wait, why is that not happening here? And actually, it was already happening. There were people who were paying attention to what they were drinking in terms of beer, but it was small and very far apart. There was no community as such, I suppose, on the level of a movement.
Certainly
suppose,
not compared to what was happening in the United States at that time.
And there was all that excitement around it.
And New York was even kind of slow. New York City itself was slow down.
So I heard, yeah. I mean, a lot of the beers we were drinking there were not from New York.
Not from there, right. It took another three or 4 years before breweries themselves started moving into New York City. It was always a great beer town. You could always drink beer that came from other places, and there were great publicans that found those and brought those to people, but it only became a making town, after about 2011, 2012.
Yeah. Then that's kind of after my experience. But then, you could find these. Where else did I? Yes, Spoyton Doyville was near where I was staying. In Williamsburg. And, just wander around there on my day off and just
Mugs in Williamsburg always had a great craft beer selection there. Yeah.
And it wasn't
Ginger Man in Midtown in the 30s, 36th, I think it was. Yeah.
So I came back here and just started homebrewing.
Yeah.
You get a lot of homebrewers listening to your...
Tasting that beer was enough to say, hey, I want to try to make beer now.
Yeah. I mean, my dad had made some homebrews when I was younger, and they were... Yeah, we had exploding things in the cupboard and all sorts. So there was some there was some trauma that had to be dealt with in order for this to be overcome.
So you come back here and you start homebrewing.
Yeah. So Yeah, I spent a couple of years, working and then homebrewing. First of all, there was an idea to like, does this have any legs? And obviously the first question you need to ask yourself is, well, what is it like to make beer? Is this something that you actually want to physically do?
Sure.
Because I've been involved in cheese for a long time and I love it. But I very quickly learned that actually making cheese was not where my passion was, I suppose.
Sure.
I have a passion for it. But waking up at 5 a.m. to milk animals, which is really the essence of it. You can get milk from somewhere else, but it's not quite the same thing.
Right.
So, maybe beer production was like that, maybe brewing, maybe I wouldn't enjoy it. So yeah, I homebrew for a while. And as you know, homebrewing allows you just to do everything all at once, change 17 variables, be as scientific or as not, be creative, be stupid, be,
sure,
hopefully not injurious to anybody's health by making bad decisions. Yeah, after a while you figure, okay, you can make something that's reasonable. And then, a little bit of faith, I suppose, that you have an idea that will get you somewhere. So we started off on a 2009. So 2 years later, I opened the brewery on a whimsically small budget of tiny amounts of money, making, our kit was 600 liters at a time. So it's probably like 5 US barrels, something like that, 5, 6, which was small.
Small,
still is,
but lower stakes. And
it was just me and some friends to help out. Yeah. We had another railway arch. About we were about half a mile down the road.
Yeah,
sharing with some friends because rent was expensive. So from my cheese making days, one friend was making cheese in that arch, and another friend was importing Italian cheese and ham and stuff. And we all moved together. So the ham and cheese guys just on that side, and Cap Casing, the cheesemakers, is a block down that way. So we're still here in the same family in the same neighborhood. But we started off sharing one of these arches together, divided up into a brewery, cheese making, and that also it shared the burden, but also the personal side of things. You had somebody just to help you dig a drain or paint something or make a sign or whatever it is that needed doing, of which there's always a lot.
Yeah, you didn't have to deal with the same kind of solitary act of brewing alone. You had other people around you that were also creatively minded that at least felt like you were doing something together. Now you're
exactly
4 arches here, 3. Yeah, so it's quite a bit different than the early days.
Yeah, and there's 20 of us working here total, including the tap room. So it's still it's still a relatively small business, but compared to the early days when you're doing everything and you're getting friends to come in and help in return for beer. So
yeah. Well, let's. I want to talk. Next, the question I would normally kick, or I always kick this off with, was the kind of creative spark behind the brewery. Every brewery starts generally with an idea. There's enough. It's not just enough to say, I want to make beer. You generally need to have an idea of what kind of beer you're going to make, why you're going to make it, and have some purpose that drives it, more than just, I want to make money from it. And so I want to talk to you about that. Clearly you're a thoughtful person. You come at this, with a mission and a purpose behind it, and that has to translate into what you want to make and how and why you want to make it that way. So I want to talk about that. But first, ProBrew is excited to announce that they are currently featuring short lead times between 2 and 4 weeks for their in-stock ProFill rotary can fillers. These can fillers run at speeds between 100 and 600 plus cans per minute, while achieving precise and consistent filling volumes not achievable by most inline and mobile fillers. For more information, fill out their contact form on www.probrew.com or email contactus@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. Also, you like wildly aromatic IPAs and tropical lagers? Good thing Omega designed thiolized yeast for just that reason. Thiolized yeast are a new tool for brewers to bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. And wait, there's more. Omega yeast makes yeast to order with a consistent 1-week lead time, ensuring peak freshness and reliability. All right, Evan. So let's talk about that kind of creative spark. You've homebrewed enough where you realized you wanted to make and sell beer commercially. You wanted to pursue this as a business. What was the kind of genesis of the creative idea behind the Kernel? How did you decide what beers you were going to make and what identity people would then ascribe to the Kernel? How they were going to think about it? Obviously, this is early 20 teens. You could go lots of different directions at that point with it, and you chose your direction. What is that Kernel direction?
I mean, I think the direction was hops, but hops mean lots of different things, and the meaning has changed.
Sure.
So much over the last 15 years.
Right.
Hops were almost what I hadn't ever really discovered drinking beer here. Say if I drank Guinness or, hops appear as in a cask English bitter or whatever. There were hops in lagers, but nothing appeared clearly until, say, that trip to the States where somebody pulls out something and go, Columbus is in this beer. And then suddenly your brain goes, I have a flavor I can associate with the word Columbus. Or, in those days it might be something like a
Citra was
three-hearted.
So new. Yeah.
This was before Citra.
So
I don't think I remember. Yeah, so three-hearted would have been a Centennial beer. So our first commercial beer was with Centennial. Citra had, I didn't get access to Citra at least until a year later. Well, it was not a loss. I didn't know it existed. It's fine. But there was a very specific, not just the hops, but I suppose also a clarity of flavor. So there was a very specific type of American Pale Ale or IPA that was about the hops in a clear and precise way that, we're all familiar with now. So, what I'm saying inspired me is absolutely the most banal thing in the universe, because maybe that's exactly what, entices so many people to drink beer. But to my mind, I hadn't really seen it before or come across it before. And it just, it was one of those things that just made absolute sense. What actually even clarified that further was coming back here and then trying to find some of these American beers that I'd drunk in New York and say I could find, I was living in Brooklyn and you could find Brooklyn Lager everywhere, which is, a wonderful baseline if that's all you could find at that point in time. Over here, I could find Brooklyn Lager. And I'd be really excited. You go grab a bottle and then crack it open, chill it, drink it, and then realize, and it really took me quite a while to figure out that, but this bottle is like 9 months old, and it's been sat in somewhere warm. And suddenly it's like, okay, so there's also a point to being local, and maybe part of that point is also being fresh. And so then you're building up this conception of what beer and what the important points are, to be local, to be fresh, you're like the question you're asking me, what are you trying to get out of it? Right. What are you trying to make? Who are you as a brewer, and what are your beers? And so for me, it's always been trying to make, a clear and distinct, in this case, pale ale, that was just trying to express itself, but, in a clear and precise way. So, for us over here, in a sense, that means using American yeast, using the California ale yeast, because for me, when I'm talking about that sort of just that specific, relatively neutral yeast that provides a wonderful platform for hops to do their thing. So the first commercial beer we made was a Centennial Pale Ale. It's a single hop Centennial. The malt bill was pretty plain. We probably added a few caramels, but a tiny amount. We stopped doing that after a while. So the base on our pale ales is just English maris otter, Cal Ale yeast, and quite often just one type of hop, and that's kind of still how we roll. Yeah. But that was that. Yeah. Things have changed, but that's how it happened.
I love hearing it from your perspective, right? Because from my perspective, and amongst American brewers, we see the exact inverse of that, right? Where historically Belgian, German, English imported styles, by the time they make it to the United States, the beers that we hold up as models to try to, make iterations of don't taste like they should. And so, we've had, and the exact opposite is also true now as American beers, creative American beers are filtering back overseas in lots of different ways, which stresses just how important it is to try those in their, native country, native regions, at those breweries that are making them to be able to taste exactly what they're doing. And it's the same everywhere, right? It's the same whether you're drinking lager in Germany or you're drinking triple in Belgium or you're drinking cask ale right here in London. So nonetheless, you decide that you want to focus the kernel on making hoppy beers with clarity, but you also are pulling in a lot of English tradition at the same time that you do that. If I look at, say, now what your tap board looks like, which, maybe it has evolved over the last decade, maybe not. Now you still base a lot of the beer styles. Most everything is pretty sessionable, 7% or below. There are still a lot of traditional approaches to style, whether that's porter or dry stout. And yet they all seem to have, you've got some saisons and table beer there, pulling a little bit of that Belgian tradition, but a lot of, the more traditional, the beers that you're making reference English traditions, but then put a kernel spin on it. Talk to me about how, you idealize, how you envision that. Or am I reading this incorrectly?
No. I think it's just, for me, a question of, our evolution, I suppose, as a brewery, and how each of those different types of beers fits into that, or how they all kind of fit into the vision of the whole.
Sure.
The initial impulse was to make, a hoppy pale ale IPA. Our table beer is less a Belgian style. It's actually just a lower alcohol version of that same idea, which has always worked surprisingly well. But the other side, at least initially, was also to do with, our heritage and tradition as being a London brewery, and also, so growing up in Ireland drinking Guinness, dark beers, just completely normal.
Sure.
And coming over here, it was a bit of a shock because London is the home of porters and stouts, and yet they were pretty much not quite extinct, but very rare apart from Guinness. So, Guinness came over here and learned how to make porters and stouts, and then took all this knowledge back to Ireland and obviously made a very successful name for himself. Whereas all the great Guinness
dominate the entire world's economy for
there's
dark
that too.
beer.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas all the Guinness and where all the porter and stout breweries that existed in London, the Barclay Perkins, the Trumans, and all of these, they're gone. Some names still live on, like Courage, but they live on as names. They live on as breweries that have moved elsewhere, and they don't make that many dark beers anymore. I think there were points almost in the 70s and 80s where porter had almost become extinct in England. And as far as you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but like something like Anchor Porter was at certain points.
I will bow out to Ron Pattinson on all of this.
Well, yeah. But Anchor Porter was one of the few porters still being brewed in the world.
Right.
There were also other Baltic porters and stuff being brewed elsewhere, but England had almost lost that tradition.
Yeah.
So moving over here from Ireland and just discovering that the traditions and histories of dark beer had been lost, or at least had lapsed, was kind of confusing, actually, considering coming from a dark beer drinking culture.
Yeah.
So why people are afraid of dark beers? But the other inspiration behind that, which is probably more forceful, is I was part of a homebrewing club when I was homebrewing before starting the brewery, the London Amateur Brewers, and there were a couple of members of that club who were members of another homebrewing club called the Durden Park Beer Circle. I don't know if you've come across them, but they've made, in the 70s and 80s, made self-published pamphlets where they'd gone into the archives, very much like Ron Pattinson does, extract the information and turning it into something that's usable for a modern day homebrewer. So they would, their recipes are all listed there by year and by style, and scale to 1 gallon. So, they've changed all the, the bushels and various different,
sure.
The difficult bits for us to comprehend into something comprehensible, that we could turn in as homebrewers into something usable. And I remember the first moments, one of the members there, a guy called Mike, brought in it was a Flowers Christmas Stout from 1868. And, he just passed it around, and it was, that was another one of those moments of like,
sure.
Growing up on Guinness, and even, getting excited by, the foreign export stout. And here was that same style of beer being elevated to something completely it's like, oh, okay, now this all makes sense. As in why people drank dark beer in London hundreds of years ago. What was this tradition all about? And then you realize, okay, it's because, of course, the beers were really good. Otherwise, the tradition would have, died out ages ago.
What made them good for you as a brewer, as a home brewer even then, or as a brewer now looking at them, is that the way those recipes worked with London water?
Precisely.
Okay.
Well, I mean, that's that. But first of all, we're based in London, so there's a historical and cultural sort of reference that there's a whole.
Sure,
we have
sure.
They hold a place with us, even if
Right.
if we've only been brewing here for 15 years. I don't know. They make sense in
Sure.
Does it need to mean any more than that? This one here is one of those recipes. Actually, this is actually a Ron Pattinson recipe, so it's an 1890 recipe. But so the export stout is what the British would have exported in the 1800s to various of their colonies around the world. And this particular one, we try and keep at least the spirit to be in the spirit of the original beer. There's no dry hops. There's no interesting other things. There's just malt.
Without dry hops, there's still a lot of hops in this.
Just bittering. So just only bittering.
Yeah.
There's nothing. There's no late additions. There's none of this sort of more modern way of dealing with things.
Well, that would have been a very inefficient way to use those hops back at the time. And given the challenge of agricultural production, no one could afford dry hops in a beer. That would be so wasteful. Why would you do that? Yeah. So what are?
But the other thing I suppose that I not really come across is brown malt. I mean, brown malt is just, I suppose, what makes a specific London flavor prominent in a dark beer. It's kind of the use of brown malt is one of the main signifiers. I suppose the brown malt in here is what kind of brings the smoky, kind of tarry, tobacco-y sort of notes. It kind of gives an edge of leather or something like that. It's not just coffee and chocolate, which are lovely flavors, and we play with them in other places. But all of the old London recipes that we cleave to are specifically kind of saturated in a certain brown malt sort of way, which is, to me, kind of both old-fashioned and kind of also really London. Kind of slightly foggy, slightly smoky. Maybe too much traffic on a bridge over the River Thames or something. But it's that's the signature of London flavors, I think, as far as I understand it.
I want to talk about brown malt. I just want to mention this as an aside. If anyone who's listening is a Craft Beer Brewing subscriber, an all access subscriber, we actually have a class on making your own brown malt with Mike Karnowski of Zebulon Artisan Ales in North Carolina, where he goes through the process because brown malt is not really available commercially in the United States. You would need to make it yourself, but he goes through the process of how to create that yourself. And as an aside, I was just talking to Mike earlier this week or late last week, and he's releasing a box set of the rise and fall of London Porter with 6 different beers that trace that. He is a fanatic, and so there are also American brewers following Ron's work and others watching this. But that's just an aside and a reference for those that are subscribers. I want to, what for you? Talk to me about how you use brown malt in porter, and how you build these historical recipes. You say build this kind of London idea for what porter is.
Sorry, I'm just trying to pick apart what's in each of the different recipes.
Sure.
I mean, this one that we're trying now, the export stout, is just pale malt, brown malt, and black malt. I suppose what's hard to know is what we interpret an old, say, black malt to be.
Sure.
We had this issue last week where our maltster says, "Oh, our black malt isn't in spec. I don't want to send you any." And we're like, "Thanks, that's good." And then we're also like, "Well, so how do you measure that?" And they're like, "Well, it doesn't quite." Because we've had batches before of, like the last time it happened was with our dry stout, where we got a batch of, in this case it was chocolate malt. We made the beer and the beer came out brown rather than black, and it's actually very hard to measure things like color, especially on a maltster's level. So when we were trying to interpret what color something was, from a recipe 150 years ago, we don't really know what it was like. Do we know what it tasted like either? Do we, so the variables.
The black and white photos or
they didn't help.
Engravers didn't help that much.
No. So, in some ways you are guided by a certain subjective choice as to what you think. And, I think as a brewer, you're always asking yourself, I suppose the question of what is the most important thing about your job. And, most brewers would fall on let's just make something that tastes really good. I mean, if there's a choice to make something more accurate, then we'll think about it. But we've already made this choice to like ferment this in stainless steel. We're keeping it away from wood, which it would have been fermented back then. That we don't have the same yeast. I mean, we could probably use the yeast from the same brewery, but that sort of sample might have been taken 50 years ago, and 100 years ago, what would they have been doing?
They weren't banking them at negative 80. In
the 1850s.
In the 1850s, no, they weren't.
But we have obviously run those experiments too.
Sure.
So on the board we have a vatted porter, or vatted stout porter, which is basically this beer that we're trying, but that one was fermented in one of our footers, and then aged beer, then blended with fresh beer, and then packaged. So it's a whole completely different thing. It's kind of funnier when you ask about like specifically about the brown malt. So we picked out this is a Truman's recipe, so it is a London recipe. So we kind of think it to be typical in terms of the malt bill used. But sort of going through the work of like Ron Pattinson or going through the Durden Park Beer Circle book, the difference between the recipes is very, very small. The proportions and percentages of different grains it doesn't vary very much, because if I had a brewery back then, I made a stout that was whatever, let's say 7%, and you made one that was around the same strength. They didn't have the plethora of choices that we have in terms of malt and hops, and maybe there was also a certain communal expectation of what a beer like that should be. So there may have been some outliers, but most of the beers aren't actually that different from one another. So while we may have played around with recipes, it kind of, again, comes down to a subjective choice, is whether you want maybe sort of brown malt higher in the mix or black malt down. You can find a recipe that will suit that almost. Yeah. So it isn't really the specificity of it. I think through the different layers of translation we have to make in order to interpret what that recipe would be, gets a little bit lost, If we made a brewery, we've done Barclay Perkins recipes from the same era as this Truman's recipe. I mean, to our mind, there isn't enough of a difference really once we've interpreted to fit in our brew house. So, so a lot of those small differences.
And you're also capturing snapshots in time, because all of those recipes also constantly evolved. They evolved at the same time that the technology around the ingredient production was evolving. I mean, this is the Industrial Revolution. Things are happening, moving quickly. And so everything was a moving target then, just as it continues to be now, as all of our ingredients still change on a year-to-year basis, and we're much more conscious of those agricultural inputs and all of those pieces. From your perspective, though, the brown malt piece, how big of it is generally in this recipe, in terms of percentage, and what do you think that it does is this middle ground, between the very dark chocolate malt or black malt that you're using and the pale malt, the base malt. It obviously has to become some sort of bridge between those two.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what percentage this is. I think it is close to, I'm guessing 8%. Yeah, the brown malt just rounds out the black malt, I think, with that sort of leathery, tarry, tobacco-y sort of notes. I think maybe also that we have it in our beers to such a degree that it becomes it's like with the railway tracks overhead. I don't hear them. You've probably noticed all of these things going, what are these interruptions? They're just like breathing. You just live in this environment, they become second nature. Sure. I think the brown malt in our dark beers is so much a part of it that I actually sometimes struggled to pick it out.
Yeah. Where do you get your brown malt from?
Pretty much all of our malt comes from Simpson's. Simpson's malt. So their maltings is an hour and a half north of here, just on the Norfolk-Suffolk border, and all of their malt is really good, but their colored malts are specifically I seem to think that I feel they put a bit more care and effort into than some others, but yeah, again, how a brown malt approximates a brown malt from 150 years ago, who knows? And, even before this, there are recipes with diastatic brown malts where you might have 100% of the grist would be just brown malt. And then we haven't got hold of any diastatic brown malt. I'm sure you're the guy you just mentioned probably
Mike,
could
yeah.
sort us out at some point. But
All right.
that's a whole other level of, a brown beer that
Right.
we are yet to experience.
Talk to me about hops in this, export porter. Or did I switch beers accidentally there?
No. So that was an export stout, and the next one is an export porter.
Oh, okay. So that's export stout. Okay. I should also, like I noted, that is, say, for an export stout, for a British stout, feels more bitter than I would have typically ascribed to a British stout.
Oh, okay. But again, this is brewed to the 1890. But again, how did they measure bitterness in those days, and what did they?
Sure.
What does that tell
Sure.
us? I think a
What
lot
I'm
of those
trying-
beers
yeah.
would have been very bitter just because of the exportness of the
Sure.
the title, because those things would have been shipped and stored and transported, and obviously they had figured out by that point in time that hops in a beer helped with preservation.
What I am simply saying that in the sense that I think that, American brewers now have a bit of a caricature of American being hoppy and British being maybe a little more malty and sweeter. And I don't know that always holds true. I think that might be a shorthand that doesn't always serve the ideas of these beers themselves. That's all that was my only.
No. That is a point that we deal with on a daily basis, I suppose, because it's kind of the question of the heart and soul of any type of beer is tied up in that. For example, with an IPA, we still keep our IPAs to what we like in terms of bitterness, which it might be a 7% beer with 50, 55 IBU, whereas there's a newer, more modern kind of New England interpretation of an IPA, which is got much less bitterness. And so now when a customer comes to the bar and orders an IPA, what are they thinking of? Are they thinking of something that's bitter and clear and, I suppose, modern?
Sure.
In modern parlance, we'd call that West Coast or something. And then there's now an East Coast and a New England style, which is actually quite a different beer. And so there is this, that's
It gets even crazier now, Evan, because now the West Coast IPAs have gotten less and less bitter too.
Is that happening over in? Is that happening there? I thought it's just. I was wondering, is that in the UK?
No,
People just willfully misinterpreting everything.
We're finding a few that are still willing to get like really grippy with those, 70 plus IBU. Where
Only a few,
but it's fewer and fewer, and now it's more common to even find these West Coast IPAs in that 50 to maybe 60 IBU. Anyway, that's a whole nother subject.
That is.
I just found it interesting, and do find it interesting that some of the stereotypes that we might hold around these things maybe don't explain 100% of everything, that there's always exceptions to these. And there's, when you get into a place and you taste the breadth of the beers, there's always more to it than you expect, from the kind of limited focus and limit, what gets imported and what you might have an experience with. And so British stout in this sense, especially historically, really firm and bitter. I mean, with a good kind of, punchy dark malt note, a little kind of acidic edge to it, and a lot of, a decent amount of bite.
I think also you'd probably notice it even more with porters because, for at least in the UK, stouts became associated with Guinness.
Yeah.
But obviously traditionally stouts were a stronger beer than a porter. And so stouts became associated with Guinness, and porters became associated with, generally a slightly more ruby, fruity, kind of rounded beer that often didn't have much bitterness. Whereas, again, going back to these historical recipes, stouts and porters were often pretty much the same family, just, one slightly stronger than the other.
Right.
And so, a porter like this still has quite a heft of bitterness. You have the bitterness from the hops, and you have a bitterness from all of those, burnt dark malts. You get them just layering up on top of each other, which I suppose reflects exactly where this particular beer came from. Because for us, when you're kind of thinking about an IPA and its relationship to, a historical IPA in relationship to a modern IPA, the modern IPAs that are, born on the west coast of the States, using that clean California yeast, and these new American hops, like, go back to the beginning and think of something like Cascade. You have this bright hop flavor profile. And these beers are not being stored away and transported halfway around the world. They're being, served as fresh as they possibly can be. And the whole experience is quite different. So for us with a beer like this, this was originally that old IPA recipe that was shipped to India, except it was porter, because porter was the drink of the soldier. It was only the officers that could afford the IPAs.
Really?
Yeah, there was 6 or 8 times more porter shipped to India than IPA.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because it's a drink of the it's much easier to make. It doesn't have to be clear. You can hide any load of flaws, as a,
Sure.
we've all been homebrewers and managed to hide some flaws in a dark beer, whereas a precise pale beer, you don't get away with much. So it's
especially at that time where, again, malt production was pretty variable and,
exactly.
much less consistency in the industrial, malt output of the time. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more. Let's talk more about this porter, because there's, you've also got a Kernel twist on it. And there are interesting ways that you approach this. And I really want to dive into this idea of India porter as something that we should bring back again, or maybe it actually exists in some broader sense as black IPA and Cascadian dark ale, and that there actually really is a historical precedent for this idea of black IPA. Maybe there is a history there that we can dive back into. Before we talk about that, brewers, are you looking for the best beer, mead, and cider recipes on the planet? Join the American Homebrewers Association to unlock the 2023 National Homebrew Competition medal-winning recipes. American Homebrewers Association members have access to nearly 1,400 trusted and tested recipes, plus a Zymergy magazine subscription, exclusive discounts, live webinars, instruction videos, and more. Plus, sign up for a membership by December 31st and select a free brewing book, a $25 value. Learn more at homebrewersassociation.org/CBBpod. Also, building a brewery requires coordination, equipment, supplies, funding, and more. It's enough to overwhelm any savvy brewer. Lotus Beverage Alliance simplifies the process, offering all of the elements for your business in one place. Need an ally for your brewing venture? Their team of engineers, brewery consultants, and financial advisors are here to help. With Lotus on your side, you can focus on what you do best, brewing exceptional beverages. All right, Evan, I love this idea of India porter. There are still American brewers, I imagine, who think of black IPA as a West Coast, Pacific Northwest, West Coast invention. But I love the idea that there is this strong historical precedent for it with this hop forward porter here.
So I think the answer to the last question is how much, what you think the relationship between a modern IPA is with something that would have been shipped to India. So if you kind of think that an IPA that you would have drunk in India that would have survived the journey, I suppose they would have been rebottled there and whatever, how that relates to something that, might come out of the West Coast of the States now, to have a beer that is this hoppy that would then have been shipped halfway around the world, what would it have tasted like? But, there are those, I think they're quite, I don't think they hold up to scrutiny, but the stories of, the shipwrecked kind of boat carrying IPA that kind of washed up on a beach near Liverpool, and then people found all these casks of beer that was destined for India and obviously tapped it and drank it, and that created the craze for this new concept of India Pale Ale. It sounds quite far-fetched, but if all we're saying is that, this beer was not shipped halfway around the world and somebody thought it was quite good before they sent it out, there's probably somebody at the brewery.
Pretty sure that
there's probably 99% of people at the brewery thought, oh God, that'll be nice in 6 months' time, but let's send it off. And there's one person going, oh, I don't know, I quite like it the way it is,
Sure. And I'm sure
but
that
the hopping rates,
I'm sure there was
the hopping
guys
rates,
I think this is going to be good in 6 months. Let's just put it in our own barrel and hold on to this so we can have it here, in another 6 months. After it takes the edge off.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And nonetheless, we don't have to, we go through all of these hoops.
Oh, we can.
Just, to try to create some idea like there's more authenticity to something just because it has this historical precedent. And I think that's not necessary in the world of beer, but it's fun to think about.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's fun to think about in the sense that what's old is new again. And we always feel like we're inventing new things. But the reality is that, we all exist in some big cycle, and history repeats itself, doesn't it? That sometimes these things come back again, and they come back again because the flavors are good and they resonate with people, and there's something to it. Even what we have in hazy IPA.
Precisely.
There have been these, sweeter histories of beer, and from time to time, and that doesn't define all of it. It just, it's a moment, and then the moment's gone, and we come back to it. We'll come back to it in the future. This is just interesting though, because thinking about a historical foreign porter, export porter with this kind of hoppiness, I mean, it really does have a lot in common with.
But yeah. I mean, I mean, it should make clear that this one we have specifically not held to the original hopping schedule. We have hopped it.
Tell me about that. Sure.
But we've just hopped it as we would a modern IPA.
Okay.
So it's kind of, this is the reflection, in the way that a modern IPA reflects an old IPA.
This is a reflection
of an old export India porter recipe. So the base, the malt bill and the grist are relatively how we would think they would be.
Yeah.
But it's hopped, late hopped, dry hopped, all those things that were probably a bit expensive to do back in the day, and then probably also people were maybe not necessarily interested in those flavors in the same way,
And this gets to that kernel idea again, right? Of clarity and focus and hoppy beer. So talk to me then how you take this foreign export porter, that's clearly a hoppy style, just in its purest form, and put a modern kernel spin on it.
I mean, when we first started brewing this, I wasn't aware of any other. No, sorry. There was like one or two other historical recreations like around the UK, but I mean, they weren't all that up to much. I definitely didn't come across any export India porters or such like. So I mean, it wasn't that necessary to do much else other than to recreate it in a way that we thought was at least faithful to the idea. We're not necessarily being exactly accurate in our recreation, but at least we wanted to make, beer that people would enjoy. With all our beers, pretty much, we will change the hopping according to what we think. Whoever is brewing that day will have either inspiration or not, maybe just frustration. But I mean, obviously the good hops that work really well on this recipe keep coming back. We do tend to skew to American West Coast hops because there is a certain, to my mind anyway, there's a certain synergy between something, the flavors in this and specifically something like Columbus. This particular one has Equinaut and it's got Idaho 7 and HBC 431. So the two American varieties. Idaho 7 has a certain woodiness as well to it. So, hops like that or Simcoe that have a certain kind of woody, piney thing seem to work better than some of the fruitier hops. But we will probably try most hops with this beer, as we brew it relatively frequently. We've done it with lots of English hops as well. It comes across beautifully, but like as a quite different beer in the way that an IPA hopped with English hops is very different from an IPA hopped with American hops.
Sure. So what is a typical, to kernelize this historical recipe using modern hops? When do you select those additions? And, how do you balance out those hop additions throughout this export India porter?
It's one of those things that's quite hard to answer because, we've probably been making this beer for 12 years. It's kind of, you get used to how to do it and it's quite hard to explain.
Okay.
As in, I don't really know how to explain. I think a lot of it is trial and error. But with a beer like this, the malt...
Do you push, towards later hop additions in the boil, whirlpool hops? Or do you, now like push, very early hops in any kind of, specific way, whether that's mash hopping or first wort hopping, or, are you cranking out some, baseline bittering additions early on, and then filling out some of the more modern hop flavor towards the end of that? What's the broader process?
Most of that. Across most of our beers, we will first wort hop. Supposed to clarify. We have our system is designed to use English leaf hops. We can also use T90 pellets, and obviously we can use bittering liquid alpha acid.
Right. Flowable hop products.
Yes, those guys. Our preference and the majority of what we use still is leaf.
Really?
So
even in some of these American hopped.
Yeah. I was talking to you about our bottle conditioning process, which being quite unique. I think using leaf hops as well is still also, or still has become less of a commonplace procedure.
You guys in Sierra Nevada, leaf hops, bottle conditioning, everything. Yeah.
There you go.
It's good.
The leaf hops
company
do.
to
The
be
texture does. I mean, maybe the texture is slightly harder to pick in the darker beers because they already have a lot of texture. But in the paler beers, it is noticeable to me with, because we can make a beer with pellets and we can make pretty much the same beer with leaf. Obviously, when we're dry hopping, we will just dry hop with T90 pellets. There are other ways you can dry hop with other forms of hop products, but no, we use T90 pellets because it's leaf hops. Yeah, we will first wort hop and then hop progressively towards the end of the boil. Maybe 15 minutes before the end, 10 minutes before the end, 5 minutes before the end. We will whirlpool if we're just using pellets. And then we will have a dry hop addition. And that's probably across all of the beers that have, significant hop loads in them, like this porter.
You mentioned, that some of these Pacific Northwest, less fruity, but more woody and piney hops tend to work better with the flavor component of that. Are there some that you find yourself going back to frequently for it?
Yeah, Columbus, Centennial, Simcoe. But it's kind of hard to know. I mean, we still use a lot of Citra Mosaic in the brewery, but I mean, Centennial, Simcoe, and Columbus, I suppose they were around when the brewery started for us to use, and I suppose we've evolved kind of, with those hops to a certain degree. So they're kind of tied up in our DNA, in how we've learned to brew has always been kind of tied up with those particular hops, I suppose. Also a little bit of Nelson Sauvin.
Even really.
Yeah, I mean, we had access to certain New Zealand hops through hop merchants over here, also from the beginning. So Nelson Sauvin has been around with us all that way through.
Nice. Let's talk about fermentation in these stouts and porters. If you look at historical fermentation, as you mentioned, would have been wooden vessels, most likely open top fermentation. You've got a cellar here of cylindriconicals and some fooders too. But you can use techniques with modern equipment to approximate some of the approaches towards yeast stress and whatnot. How do you approach fermentation on your stouts and porters in terms of yeast choice and then maintaining healthy fermentations through the process?
I mean, I suppose all the stouts and porters, even the ones with lots of hops in, they're still such a malt-dominated beer that yeast-wise, we will usually use our house strain is a version of the Californian ale yeast. So most of these will have the Californian ale yeast. However, we do have another English strain that we use for other beers, like the bitter we had a taste of. Sometimes we'll use that yeast, which is an old London ale strain. Sometimes we use that for the porter or the stout. It seems to strangely make less difference than I think it should.
Really?
But then we would rarely repitch from either of these beers. We will sometimes, but it depends on the brewing rotation. We usually have some fresh yeast from a pale ale or an IPA. So I suppose we have to be, we don't have to be completely on it in terms of the fermentation, as in we're not going to carry it on for another couple of generations after it has been through any of these beers.
I guess the flip side of it can be said for, the America's favorite hazy IPA yeast, London Ale 3, that you can make perfectly clean and clear beer with that if you approach it from that kind of perspective, or you can make soft and fruity beer with that if you approach it from that perspective.
Yeah.
And
so I think
how you use it, right?
The bitter we tried is that ale strain, which is, it started as a London Ale thing and now has become, if you purchase this yeast from, in a different form from another supplier, it's got a label of a brewery attached who are specifically known for making hazy IPAs. So it is the yeast for using to make hazy IPAs, whereas also being, the traditional London beer yeast for,
making your
porters and stouts, because that's London brewing.
But you can make it low ester and, again, just...
And clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you just go for a pretty clean fermentation then, primarily using Chico on these.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it comes down to a certain idea of a certain clarity. With beers like this, I think we want just, the malt body and the malt focus to be the point of the beer. And that Californian ale yeast does always really allow something else to shine. I mean, I can understand the argument that you might want a bit more complexity. But we found when using the London Ale yeast that it doesn't necessarily, it changes the beer slightly, but it doesn't, it adds as much as it takes away. It depends to some degree on what it is exactly that you're looking for.
Can you articulate that in a more, I'm curious what that is. What does it add? What does it take away?
Even fermenting it to kind of minimize the esters with the London Ale yeast, it's still a lot more estery than the Chico yeast. I suppose the question of the esteriness or not of what you want the final beer to be is perhaps a personal opinion. And also how it affects how the hops shine through. I think, with the Chico yeast, I think the hops come through a little bit more, and the esters being a bit lower means that the malt profile, to my mind, is a little bit more precise. However, again, we've been using that Chico yeast since the beginning, and we've only been using the London Ale 3 yeast for a couple of years. So, again, once something is so much part of your DNA, it's really hard to evaluate in a way that's actually impartial. It's kind of trying to think about how you breathe. It's like, I don't know.
We've been talking a little for a while now about brewing. Let's pull back out a little bit. Let's look at it from 30,000 feet, looking at where the kernel is now versus where the kernel was when it started, and looking forward, say 5 years. What are you happy that you've achieved over the last 10 years, creatively and business-wise? What do you still hope to achieve? What is still left to accomplish for you in the next 5 or 10? And maybe 5 or 10 isn't the right future to think about. We're in a city where you have breweries that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, where you have, a monarchy that's extraordinarily old, where, history is measured in 1,000 years plus. But what would you like to achieve with the kernel? And what are you happy about achieving so far?
That actually seems like about 8 really big questions. The sense of the long view of time, though, I really hope it's not just a London thing. But, that is one of it's a slight tangent to what you've asked, but I suppose it's kind of fundamental to how I might answer it. But, there are decisions people make for short-term benefit or gain, or just because they have to, and there's decisions people might make because they hope this will be the right decision in the long term. It just feels like the world we live in now, nobody's given enough time to make decisions for the long term. So we're making decisions for short term gain, which, in the end maybe prove detrimental across all aspects of our lives. No, I didn't really start with much of an idea of an end point. I suppose it would be nice to try and think that we started with a certain set of principles of what we thought was important about what it is we were doing. And I think the beers have evolved since we started, but they're also still very recognizably ours. Our pale ales and IPAs are still what I consider to be least true to the spirit and essence of our initial pale ales and IPAs, in the sense that I like, we still haven't brewed something that would be identifiable as a New England IPA, for example. Not that I don't like them, but it's just that it's not who we are. And I think to have that sort of relationship with what it is that you produce is something that we collectively as a brewery have that's strong enough to allow us to produce the same beers, is something that's actually, that does make me happy. But in terms of ambitions, goals, I don't think I think like that, really. There's just a constant sense of, I suppose, of evolution and looking after the workforce, making sure that, people are happy, making sure that beers are tasting good. It really doesn't have to my mind, be much beyond that. But then I think there's a different question as to maybe how that reflects on the wider world of brewing. But I think that's actually slightly beyond my ability to actually really consider properly. I don't know. I think just being focused exactly on what's, that beer that we're brewing today. Obviously, there are some bigger picture things that one has to think about, but it's just about being present in a certain moment of, respecting each batch of beer as it comes, rather than just churning out another iteration. Just making sure that the energy that we all have is on that particular batch of beer, rather than on just repeating a task that doesn't have a meaning anymore. I think just trying to make that present for all of us is kind of how I see what I'm trying to do just here today.
From my perspective, there's this interesting grounding of innovation and tradition, and this interesting melding of those two, that there's this kind of historical underpinning to what you do. There's this, you fully understand the weight of history while and the environment that you're brewing in, while at the same time you understand that time also moves forward, and that agriculture and processes also, will continue to evolve and develop, and that the things, the tools that you have at your disposal to make compelling things for people to drink, are continuing to expand, and finding a way to pull those in while also grounding them and rooting them in this history and tradition of what you are. That's an interesting thing. And that's, I think, what makes the Kernel interesting.
Thank you.
On that note, let's just bring this to a close. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. If you're looking for an ideal German lager hop, try a Mira from HVG, available through BSG. Trust the experts at Old Orchard to schedule freight for your flavored craft juice concentrate blends. ProBrew has rotary can fillers in stock with 2 to 4 week lead times. Omega stylized yeasts bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. Join the American Homebrewers Association to unlock the 2023 National Homebrew Competition medal-winning recipes, and Lotus Beverage Alliance's team of engineers, brewery consultants, and financial advisors are here to help with your next brewery project. If you enjoy this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. And if you are an all-access subscriber, go back and check out Mike Karnowski's of Zebulon Artisan Ales class on making your own brown malts, and then, of course, brewing with it. He is also a disciple of these historical recipes and doing some cool stuff there. And it was fun to hear that come back up again in this topic. Evan, thank you for sharing some beers and some thoughts with me. If people want to learn more about the Kernel, where do they learn more about you? Both in real life and out there on the internet.
In real life, we're based in Southeast London. Where you can easily find us on thekernelbrewery.com, or there's an Instagram at Kernel Brewery. There's a list of places in London that serve our beers on the website as well, if you're in town, because there are, a number of good London pubs, which I'm sure you'll take time to visit on your trip here. Matt
gave me a good list. I'm trying to take them off. But coming out here to the tap room under Arch 7 and getting to hear the trains roll over us just feels like a Kernel experience. Now, of course, if you're here on a Monday or Tuesday, you won't be able to do it here in the tap room. You need to go find another place to drink those. But there are plenty of places, like the place I was at last night, the Harp in Covent Garden. So some of the more respected pubs also sell your beer, which speaks a lot to how much even the hardest of hardcore traditionalists have an appreciation for the beer that the Kernel makes. And on that note, I think we should bring close. Cheers, Evan. Thanks for talking with me.
Thanks very much for having me.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.